is increased and prices are reduced. New topic. The 4 laws of economic freedom. Prosperity also depends on a climate of wholesome stimulation protected by law. Reduced to its simplest formula, there are 4 laws of economic freedom which a nation must maintain if its people are to prosper at the maximum level. These are: number 1, the freedom to try. Number 2, the freedom to buy. Number 3, the freedom to sell. And number 4, the freedom to fail. By 1905, the United States had become the richest industrial nation in the world, with only 5% of the Earth's continental land area and merely 6% of the world's population. The American people were producing over half of almost everything: clothes, food, houses, transportation, communications, even luxuries. It was a great tribute to Adam Smith. New idea. The role of government in economics. The Founding Fathers agreed with Adam Smith that the greatest threat to economic prosperity is the arbitrary intervention of the government into the economic affairs of private business and the buying public. Historically, this has usually involved fixing prices, fixing wages, controlling production, controlling distribution, granting monopolies, or subsidizing certain products. Nevertheless, there are 4 areas of legitimate responsibility which properly belong to the government. These involve the policing responsibilities of government to prevent, number 1, illegal force in the marketplace to compel purchase or sale of products. Number 2, fraud in misrepresenting the quality, location, or ownership of the item being sold or bought. Number 3, monopoly, which eliminates competition and results in restraint of trade. Number 4, debauchery of the cultural standards and moral fiber of society by commercial exploitation of vice, pornography, obscenity, drugs, liquor, prostitution, or commercial gambling. The perspective of the founders in the economic role of government may be gathered from sentiments such as these by Washington, and I quote, "Let vigorous measure self, but to punish speculators, forestallers, and extortioners, and above all, to sink the money by heavy taxes, to promote public and private economy, encourage manufacturers, etc." New topic. After 1900, Adam Smith got lost in the shuffle. In spite of the fact that the fruits of the free market economy were making the United States the biggest and richest industrial nation in the world, the beginning of the 20th century saw many prominent and influential leaders losing confidence in the system. These included wealthy industrialists, heads of multinational banking institutions, leaders in the academic world, and some of the more innovative minds in the media. The same fervorish restlessness was taking hold in similar circles in Europe. It was true, as it is with all systems, that the market economy was in need of some adjustments and fine-tuning. But these leaders were getting ready to throw the entire system overboard. The problems of the day included a number of large-scale strikes, the rise of powerful trusts, the mysterious recurrence of boom and bust cycles, and the rise of a new populist movement in which certain agriculture and labor groups were demanding that the government get involved in the redistribution of the wealth. Many of these problems were either caused or aggravated by the very people who were demanding a new system. The new system would involve extensive government regulation, if not outright expropriation of major industries and natural resources. In Europe, certain confederations of wealthy families had gained control of their respective governments and were making a financial killing. Some of the wealthy families in America coveted the rich government monopolies of their transatlantic cousins. It was in this climate that Adam Smith and the free market economy fell out of favor. We have already discussed the rise of the intercollegiate socialist society, which was billed on major university campuses as the vanguard of the new era. Collectivism, socialism, government ownership of industry, subsidy of the farmers, and a whole spectrum of similar ideas were permeating the country when World War I broke out. This greatly accelerated the idea of strong, centralized government with regulatory power over every aspect of the marketplace. New idea. John Chamberlain describes what happened to Adam Smith. By the 1920s, the debunking of the Founding Fathers was in full swing. The adolescence of the Constitution was discussed openly. The ideas of Adam Smith were considered archaic. John Chamberlain, one of the foremost writers of our own day, was just coming up through college. He described the academic climate of that era, and I quote, "When I was taking a minor in economics as a congruent part of a history major back in the 1920s, Robert Hutchins had not yet started his campaign to restore a reading of the great books to college courses. So, we never read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We heard plenty about it, however. The professors treated it condescendingly. We were told it was the fundamentalist Bible of the old dog-eat-dog type of businessman. The businessmen in that Menschkenen time were considered the natural enemies of disinterested learning. We, as students, regarded them as hypocrites. They talked competition and invoked the name of Adam Smith to bless it. Then they voted for the high-tariff Republican Party. Somehow, Adam Smith, as the man who had justified a business civilization, got the blame for everything. We weren't very logical in those days, and we were quite obviously to our own hypocrisy in making use of our businessmen fathers to pay our college tuition fees and to take us to trips to Europe. New topic. Adam Smith out, Karl Marx in. John Chamberlain eventually came to realize what the intellectual leaders of the day were doing. They were departing the founders and the free market economy to create a vacuum, which would then be filled with a completely new formula. Their new economic nostrum was the very toxin the founders had warned against. Chamberlain described what happened. The depression that began in 1929 is generally considered the watershed that separates the new collectivist age from the old, or rugged individualist age. Before Franklin Roosevelt, we had had the Republic, checks and balances, limited government, inalienable rights to liberty and property, and all that. After 1933, we began to get the centralized state and interventionalist controls of industry. Actually, however, the inner spirit of the old America had been hollowed out in the 20s. The colleges had ceased to teach anything important about our heritage. You had to be a graduate student to catch up with the Federalist Papers or with John Calhoun's disquisition on government, or with anything by Herbert Spencer, or with The Wealth of the Nations. We were the ignorant generation. The Depression began our education, but the first great book in economics that we read was Marx's Capital. We had nothing to put against it. Talk of planning filling the air. We read George Sowell and Stuart Chase on the need for national blueprints and national investment boards and government investment. Keynes was still in the future, but his system was already being laid brick by brick, and Adam Smith was still a word of desertion. New topic: the rediscovery of Adam Smith. Our own education was similar to that of John Chamberlain. I was less than a decade behind him. We were all part of a generation of lost Americans who had to rediscover our heritage the hard way. For nearly a quarter of a century, The founders had been regulated to the pre-industrial past. Certain professors spoke disparagingly of what they called the myths the founders believed. The founding fathers were all very old-fashioned. Gradually, however, the intellectual light of day dawned on many thousands of that lost generation. Ivor Thomas wrote his book, The Socialist Strategy, explaining what socialism had done to Europe. Max Eastman wrote his Reflections on the Future of Socialism, explaining what socialism had done to America and the world. For some, there was a genuine awakening. The traditional values of the founders began to emerge with a new message of promise so long neglected. John Chamberlain described his rediscovery of Adam Smith, and I quote, "We had to discover the real Adam Smith the hard way by living our mistakes, and by being led to the whole body of the literature of freedom that had created the American federal system. Only then were we able to appreciate Smith. Ironically, our education paralleled that of Adam Smith himself, which took place over a period of a dozen years between the close of the 7-Year War and the outbreak of the American Revolution. We would have been saved so much trouble if we had only been compelled to read and digest the wealth of the nations in a first college course in economics with James Madison's political theory as a side dressing. Smith's book is indeed the beginnings of everything that is important to economic theory. The lack of clarity on value theory notwithstanding, it should be the natural starting point for students of economics for the simple and compelling reason that it anticipated Ludwig von Mises by a full century and a half in considering economics as part of a wider science of human choices. Smith backed into his study by way of a general preoccupation with human destiny in a way that should be utterly convincing in our own pragmatic day. As this book goes to press, America is strenuously struggling to restore a few of the lost jewels from the founders' treasury. An application for Adam Smith is looming larger. If it continues, there is hope for a brighter future for the next generation than for the one just passing. A genuine return to the founders, however, will also involve the completion of something which has never been done, neither in the founders' day nor in ours. It is the need for a genuine monetary reform along the lines the founders envisioned but were never able to launch. New topic. One responsibility of government never completely fulfilled. At the Constitutional Convention, the founders determined that they would make the American dollar completely independent of any power or combination of powers outside of the American people. They therefore gave the exclusive power to issue and control money to the people's representatives, the Congress, and forbade anybody, even the state, to meddle with it. Not only was Congress to be held responsible for the issuing of money, but it was to see that its purchasing power remained fixed. In other words, the value of the money was to remain steady and reliable not only in the United States, but also in relation to foreign money. They therefore stated in the Constitution that Congress would have the power, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. All money was to be coined in precious metal. Paper notes were to be promises to pay in gold or silver, not legal tender as such. States were strictly forbidden to allow debts to be paid except in terms of gold or silver. You can find that in Article 1 and Section 10. Washington stated, and I quote, "We should avoid the depreciation of our currency. But I conceive this end would be answered as far as might be necessary by stipulating that all money payments should be made in gold and silver, being the common medium of commerce among nations." New topic. What went wrong? Here is one area where a great idea of the founders was never adequately implemented. The founders were just coming out of a devastating depression when the Constitution was adopted, and under pressure from both European and American financial interests, a whole series of policy errors were committed which have continued to this day. For example, the issuing of money was turned over to a private consortium of bankers who set up a privately owned bank called the Bank of the United States. A similar arrangement exists today under the Federal Reserve System. The indignant protest of Thomas Jefferson can be heard across the vista of 2 whole centuries. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. The issuing power of money should be taken from the banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it belongs. New idea. Fractional banking. The bank was allowed to issue 3 or 4 times more paper notes or loans than it had in assets. This is called fractional banking because the bank has only a fraction of the assets needed to back up the paper money or credit which has issued. Once again, Jefferson protested. The banks themselves were doing business on the capital's assets, 3/4 of which were fictitious. Jefferson foresaw that the banks would inflate the economy by loaning out fractious paper money with no assets behind it. This would boom the economy. Then, when the financiers had lured borrowers into a precarious position, they would call for a bust and foreclose on the property for which the bank had virtually furnished nothing. At the first signs of a spending bust, Jefferson lamented, "This fictitious capital is now to be lost and to fall on somebody. It, the bank, must take on those who have property to meet it, and probably on the least cautious part, who, not aware of the impending catastrophe, have suffered themselves to contract or to be in debt, and must now sacrifice their property of a value many times the amount of the debt. We have been truly sowing the wind, and are now reaping the whirlwind." Amazingly, this disastrous pattern of boom and bust has been repeated off and on for over 200 years without the cause of it being corrected. A sound monetary reform program is still begging for a hearing. New topic: an economy of debt instead of wealth. The financiers who gained control of American finance built the economy on debt instead of wealth. Jefferson's protest came out as follows: "At the time we were funding our national debt, we heard much about a public debt being a public blessing, that the stock representing it was a creation of active capital for the ailment of commerce, manufacturers, and agriculture. This paradox was well adapted to the minds of believers in dreams. Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln all tried to get the monetary program turned around so that Congress would issue its own money and banks would be required to loan on existing assets rather than use factitious money based on merely a fraction of their assets. In other words, they wanted to get rid of the boom and bust cycle. At one point, when the idea seemed to be catching on, the London Times came out with a frantic editorial stating, "If that mischievous financial policy, which had its origin in the North American Republic during the late war in that country, the Civil War, should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized government of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." New topic: a pressing opportunity. All of this should demonstrate that somewhere up the trail, the leadership of the United States has an opportunity to add one more burst of momentum to the upward thrust of the 5,000-year leap. It will be a monumental monetary reform based on the principles which the founders understood but were never able to implement. As Jefferson said toward the latter days of his life, "We are overdone." Let me start again. We are overdone with banking institutions, which have banished the precious metals and substituted a more fluctuating and unsafe medium. These have withdrawn capital from useful improvements and employments to nourish idleness. These are evils more easily to be deplored than remedied. On another occasion, Jefferson lamented, "We are completely saddled and bridled, and the bank is so firmly mounted on us that we must go where it will guide." And that is the end of principle number 15. Welcome, and welcome back if you've been with us for any time at all. This is principle number 27. The burden of debt is as destructive to freedom as subjugation by conquest. Slavery, or involuntary servitude, is the result of either subjugation by conquest or succumbing to the bondage of debt. Debt, of course, is simply borrowing against the future. It exchanges a present advantage for a future obligation. It will require not only the return of the original advance of funds, but a substantial compensation to the creditor for the use of his money. New topic: how debt can benumb the human spirit. The founders knew that borrowing can be an honorable procedure in a time of crisis, but they deplored it just the same. They looked upon it as a temporary handicap, which should be alleviated at the earliest possible moment. They had undergone sufficient experience with debt to see its corrosive and debilitating effect, which tends to corrupt both individuals and nations. In the case of the individual, excessive debt greatly curtails the freedom of a debtor. It benumbs his spirit. He often feels hesitant to seek a new location or change a profession. He passes up financial opportunities which a free man must risk. Heavy debt introduces an element of taint into a man's search for happiness. There seems to be a perpetual burden every waking hour. There's a sense of being perpetually threatened as he rides the razor's edge of potential disaster. There is also the sense of waste, much like the man who has to make payments on a dead horse. It is money spent for pleasures or even needs that are long since past. It often means sleepless nights, recoiling under the burden of a grinding weight, which is consistently increasing with every tick of the clock, and often at usurious rates. New topic: the founder's attitude toward debt. The founding fathers belonged to an age when debt was recognized for the ugly specter that it really is. They considered frugality a virtue, and even when an emergency compelled them to borrow, they believed in borrowing frugally and paying back promptly. Nearly everyone finds it to his advantage or absolute necessity to borrow on occasion. Debt becomes the only available means, a necessary evil. Nevertheless, the founders wanted the nature of debt to be recognized for what it is, evil, because it is a form of bondage. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The maxim of buying nothing without the money in your pockets to pay for it would make our country one of the happiest on earth." Experience during the war proved this, and I think every man will remember that under all the privations it obligated him to submit to during that period, he slept sounder and awoke happier than he can do now. New topic: debts from splurge spending. The founders felt that the worst kind of debt is that which results from splurge borrowing, going into debt to enjoy the temporary luxury of extravagantly living beyond one's means. They knew the seductive snare which this possibility